Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our webinar series, Where Do We Go From Here? Conversations about community, resistance, and creativity, presented by Broadleaf Books, Fortress Press, and Beaming Books. So this is the second episode of the series. So if you missed the first one on creativity, you can find it in the same spaces on YouTube and Facebook. My name is Ross Murray. My pronouns are he, him, and I will be your host for today's episode. I'm an author who's worked with Fortress Press. I wrote The Everyday Advocate and Made Known Loved. And in my day job, my professional job, and my call as a deacon, I am a vice president at GLAD, part of the GLAD Media Institute. You've probably all been aware, I am deeply aware that the last few months have been a bunch of chaos and cruelty. And we're also seeing community resistance that's growing. But what's happening today is going to look really different than the other civil rights movements that we've probably seen or studied or even experienced in the past. So today we're going to talk about activism with our panel of experienced organizers and try to give you some tangible ideas about how you can become involved in your own communities. So first, joining me today in conversation is Jonathan Pulphus. Jonathan is an equity advocate and organizer from St. Louis, Missouri. And after the killing of Michael Brown, he became a student activist with a commitment to equity. He served as the president of St. Louis University's Black Student Alliance and was co-founder of Tribe X, a community organization. And Jonathan is the author of Life with My People, Life, Justice, and Activism Beyond the University. Welcome, Jonathan. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Then joining us next is Aaron Scott, whose latest book is Bring Back Your People, 10 Ways Regular Folks Can Put a Dent in White Christian Nationalism. Aaron is a church worker, an organizer, and a leader with the Poor People's Campaign, and a co-founder of Chaplains on the Harbor. A second-generation preacher and a third-generation organizer, he and his family live in Tacoma, Washington. So welcome, Aaron.
Thank you.
And finally, joining our conversation is Liz Walker. Liz is a minister, a journalist, an activist, and a sought-after speaker. As Boston's first Black evening television news anchor, Walker received 2 Emmy Awards and an Edward R. Murrow Award for Excellence in her field. And now Liz lives in Sarasota, Florida, and is the author of No One Left Alone, a story of how community helps us heal. Welcome, Liz.
Hi, glad to join you. Thanks for having me.
Of course, this is a great group of people and will be a great conversation. There's a lot to discuss and a limited amount of time, so I'm just going to jump in right away. First, would each of you share what inspired you to become involved and how you became involved in community organizing and activism? And maybe, Aaron, I'll ask you to go first, and then the rest of us can chime in.
Sure. So I'm a third generation organizer. So both my mom and my grandma were labor organizers. So in some ways, really just the family business. But I think for me, being born into that was much more about a posture in the world than like a set of ideas maybe in my head or a certain kind of jargon. I just remember learning from a very young age from my grandma that we are the solutions to our problems, that we are not supposed to be waiting around for anybody else, politicians, businesses, whoever, to fix things for us, that it's our responsibility to make enough noise to be heard together. And from my mom, really clear early life lessons around not expecting much from bosses, in terms of the conditions of your work, in terms of fairness, in terms of truth and transparency, that you should just expect to have to push for those things. And then I think beyond that, one of my earliest experiences was being formed in the church, in white churches, where I grew up, and understanding very clearly that those were places of pretty hot struggle. And if you were going to stick out your neck out for justice, it was going to cost you. You were going to lose your job. But that was just embedded in my understanding of what it meant to do that work, is that there will be a cost. But There will be people to catch you. Yeah.
Jonathan, how about you?
Yeah, so similar to Aaron, I was immersed in just community organizing work from a young age. My mom and Queen Mother Ramona Taylor Williams, who was the executive director for an organization named M-Slice here in St. Louis, Missouri, they would, you know, from the age of middle school, take me to ward meetings, automatic meetings,
Hmm.
coffee shops, having and discussing different issues happening in the community, whether it be environmental issues, homicides happening in the community. And so growing up in North St. Louis, where there's high levels of unemployment, high levels of drug abuse and addiction, sex work, um, fragile education system, infrastructure, homicides and robberies. That seeing these dreadful things inspired me to want to see change happen in the community as well. And so walking alongside my mom, her sister friend, we were able to address some of those issues coming up. And then, of course, when Ferguson happened, given that background with the murder of Michael Brown Jr., I was able to take some of those lessons and some of those things that were instilled in me and put that to work. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice. Liz.
My story is not unlike my co-speakers here today, except as the oldest person here, that's no doubt. My history goes way back. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas during school desegregation. I grew up not far from Little Rock Central High School. So activism is in my spiritual DNA, but also I grew up in a time and a place when there was, if you were a Black kid in the South, you were thrust into this reality. I know few Black kids who weren't. So that's kind of my background. One quick story. When I was a little girl, my father, who was a preacher, took me to another church in our town where Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking. And I was put up in the balcony because, the kids weren't supposed to be a part of this. But I remember the electricity in that sanctuary. And looking back, it was probably around the bus desegregation when he came off the Montgomery bus boycott and he was moving throughout the South. Now, this is my imagination now that this was the time. So I think that I cut my teeth on being, having a bird's eye view of some incredible moments in history and feeling that was my destiny. And and that's how I've lived my life.
That's lovely. I'll say I got involved because I was going to live a really quiet churchy youth ministry life, and came out and got support, got everything people wanted, but then joined one of those places that was less accepting. And I realized sort of that moment, for all the privilege that I have, could not, there's going to be folks that we can't get across, and just realizing that extends out to the bigger, wider rest of the world, and having to figure out how this manifests itself for so many different communities, and trying to make those changes in the church and then ultimately in the world too. I love that there's the overlap between all our experiences, and yet how distinct they end up being, how this is instilled, or moments. You all describe moments where things sort of happened that sort of changed the trajectory of your life. And I think that's huge. I think in terms of those moments, we've heard a lot from viewers of this that have been frustrated, discouraged, that there's a lot of people around us that just don't care or don't get it, or maybe I'm making an excuse for them, but also they're overwhelmed. The news is overwhelming. And it's easy to just say, I'm not going to deal with anyone. I'm just going to go back into my little bubble, and people have to figure out how to speak up and speak out without just, blind name calling and figure out what to do. So can you talk about how you share your passion for activism with others? And maybe now I want to start with Liz too, because I think you do storytelling so well.
Well, we have an organization, and thank you. Our organization is focused on healing from trauma through storytelling, and that's what the book I wrote is about. And through that program, I have learned that storytelling is the key to everything. That people can share their worst situations, their best situations, and we usually are kind of drawn into each other's stories. I too get weary, though. I think that we're all very kind of overwhelmed right now. The zone has been flooded. We all know that, right? And so you're kind of trying to keep your balance. But one of the things that I think that I suggest or I try to do is to hear somebody's story, just a little bit of somebody's story. And it might be on the street. Now, this could be risky, I'll admit that. Might be in the grocery store, might be in a kind of an unusual place, but do what you can to prompt connection, because that's resistance right now. Because the bigger picture is like, don't connect, isolate, back off, build a wall. I say try to find small ways to connect.
I love that. Others?
I mean, just to echo everything Reverend Liz said, I think it's Ruby Sales' question about like asking people, where does it hurt, right? Because people, even if folks are sticking their heads in the sand or trying to stick their heads in the sand right now, very few people actually can afford to. People are being harmed even as they're being, quieter and quieter. And so the ways that we can connect with folks through their stories and to really getting folks to understand their own and name like their own suffering under this system, and then pointing them in the direction of, okay, so do you want to be part of solving these problems that you have, because you're not actually alone in that. But I think that piece of connecting people to their pain and plugging them into community and collective efforts to address that is the way that I tend to have more effect. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to echo what Reverend Liz and what Aaron just shared, the power of storytelling. And then Aaron's point about how even if people find themselves in their own bubbles and things like that, it's the dangers is right around the corner, right? The issues are until they come to your front door. And so I would say it's important that what you do is definitely educate yourself, inform yourself on everything. Doesn't mean you have to get your information strictly from the news, major news sources. It could be through social media, and they can also be reading about things in the past, because a lot of stuff is connected. The stuff we're facing isn't necessarily new. It may look different, and it may be publicized a little bit more, but it's not necessarily new. And so I would say, investing in the intellectual pursuit of diving in history, diving in different concepts and thought pieces that are written about some of the stuff we're talking about, because what that does is it helps you realize that you're not alone in this stuff. You're not on an island by yourself, and there are other people wrestling with the same things and same ideas, and then that also creates a bridge for you to build connection and community with other people. So
yeah. I mean, I think that storytelling is so big. I love what you said, Reverend Liz, about like it breaks down the isolation. And I do one of the things we talk about at my work at GLAAD is like how you tell your story, even the origin story of like how you got involved with activism. I tell people that like people don't know until they know. And what our stories do is say, it's okay that you don't know. I didn't at one time either. And this is the thing that taught me or made me want to get involved, act. And it always like ends with this, I understand where you are, and here's the path of how I got to where I am. And this is where, the invitation is, you can join me here too. Like, come be a part of this. It's invitational. It's trying to always draw people in, and kind of that it's never too late moment. We need as many people as we can get, like now.
Can I just add one little thing too? I'm learning how to listen to other people too, because I think we all have something to say. We all have a story, but sometimes I wonder if we shouldn't learn to listen a little bit more. I think to people who might be different from us, just to try to figure out that way, if the opportunity comes up.
Yeah. And someone said that too. I think like Aaron, I think you said this, right? Listening to people actually helps to figure out where that pain is coming from, what the values are. Like it doesn't excuse behavior, but it helps you understand where it's coming from. And that's how you can figure out how to fix some of it.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah. I wanted to ask too, we mentioned before we started recording this too, of like, I said, I feel like every time you talk about like, when did this start? I just keep going back further and further and further and further and further. And like the beginning predates all of us, right? Of like, where we are now is informed by decades and centuries and millennia of the way humans have treated each other and the earth. And we see how this changes and morphs over time too, and the experience that we've had, and we've all had different lengths of experience with it too. So Jonathan, I was going to start with you just to talk about how you've seen the movements and the organizations change. I came to the realization of like Michael Brown's murder was 10 years ago now too, and it feels very recent, but to realize it's a decade old, actually realize how much has happened since then. But how have you seen the movement change since then?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to highlight this that's going on now compared to what was going on back then, and not that it necessarily didn't happen, because we face repression on many different levels, right? With what happened in Ferguson, it was both a campus movements were happening around it, but also it was the community that stood up, and that was really important, right? That it wasn't isolated as an issue that was just community or just on campuses. But I would say that the repression that I see student activists face today from, I think I read recently something at NYU where the law students were barred from taking their exams because of their direct actions and their protests, to what's happened at Columbia with Mahmoud, Khalil, and Tufts University, the way international students are being targeted and are very vulnerable in this moment. I think the repression is insane. I think when I was a student organizer at the time, that was a fear that was held by me and several other people who were involved, was the retaliation from decision makers, the idea that we could be expelled for lifting up our voices and voicing our concerns. And so I say some of that stuff is not necessarily new and it's still ongoing. What I do want to lift up now, as I have in the past, is the power of social media, right? So whereas in the civil rights movement, you had that moment where Emmett Till's mother, Mammy Till, decides to do an open casket for Emmett Till, and how that shook the world, that image shook the world.
Right.
But now with social media, you have accounts you can follow like Eyes on Palestine, where you can literally see the carnage, you can see the it's awful and it's really disgusting, just some of the videos and images you see. And so the access to that transparency, the access to those pictures and videos, I think, definitely is shocking, of course, but it creates space where people can, empathize and want to be more involved too. So, yeah.
Mm, mm, mm. You brought this up a little earlier, Ross, and I wonder, particularly to Jonathan's point, we're seeing so much. I mean, repression is so overt now, and pain is so overt, and people being abused and misused and marginalized. It's all. Do you think that it could be, I asked this of all three of you, that we are becoming, or that some of us are becoming desensitized, or it's just we normalize tragedy, we've normalized trauma?
I was thinking that while Jonathan was talking. I think, and this is how it's evolved. Social media, I think, has absolutely been a tool for how like activists and organizers connect, find each other, feel not so isolated, and especially like the Emmett Till's mother making the decision to make a visual graphic depiction out to the world was shocking because that wasn't seen. And social media has morphed, and we see everything, and I think it does make us a little desensitized. And I also am aware these are companies; they are driven by their own motivations and their profit desires, which also means in some cases the things that we used as tools have in some ways also got manipulated as like weapons. But I mean, I describe social media as like it's a tool, right? Like a hammer. I can repair a step or I can hit you on the head with it, right? And one helps and builds something and one causes immense harm. And that's how I feel about social media right now. Like it can be incredibly dangerous. And I know for queer people, youth, sometimes that's the place where they find community when they feel like nobody else around them, thinks or feels the way they do. But Jonathan, Aaron, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think just really resonating with what all three of you have said, and there's a slogan in the network of organizers, Poor People's Organizers, that trained me. What we say, movements begin with the telling of untold stories. And so for all the, for all the manipulation, for all the risk, for all the like just general danger, etc., of putting your stuff out there. Like nothing happens if we don't, right? Nothing happens if we keep the repression and dispossession and violence against our communities under wraps. And so I think exposure and figuring out how to get stories not just of what is being done to us, but also, as one of my mentors, Willie Baptist, he says, it's not just the plight of poor and oppressed people, but it's also the fight and the insight. So as long as we're raising up all three of these things consistently and on our own terms, this is really a fundamental strength for us, even with everything that folks are naming here.
I love that. Can you repeat that? It's not just the plight, it's the, because that'll preach. It'll be
it's not just the plight, but it's also the fight and the insight, right? So we're not just victims, we are also fighting back, and we have the wisdom and the leadership we need to win.
That's good. Yeah. That's good. Thank you.
Willie Baptist. Yeah.
I think the other thing, and this is kind of that social, we're also in a world now, you know, GLAAD does a lot of work in media, so this is my world, which is why I'm chiming in so much on this. But, you know, for people that come from marginalized communities, historically, someone else is telling our story or not, right? They are defining who we are. They are lifting up, here's what they are, here's what they do, or perhaps just ignoring groups altogether. One thing that we now have the power to do that doesn't exist, and I've said to people, if you don't see your story told out there, you have tools to be able to tell it in a way, and we get now talk about our life and the things that are particular to us and what are important to us too. And so that way that we do that storytelling, and I love that, Aaron, too. And then to say it's, you know, we get to talk about resilience. We don't want people to pity us. We want them to join us, right? And part of that is seeing this like momentum, fight, movement, joy, like, again, not being a one only having sad stories told about ourselves, but also these ones that show resilience, show what real life is like, that is very real about the struggles, but also very real about how much joy we get. Some of our listeners are faith leaders. We got some congregational leaders, some chaplain, right, group, and the questions have come up about, you know, engaging in what they're calling like movement chaplaincy and spiritual care for organizers and activists. And part of this work is incredibly tiring and draining. And some of us are running like headfirst into it. Some of us are trying to like strategize, and some of us are trying to care for the people that are putting themselves in harm's way as well. And so I wonder if folks have comments or thoughts about how, you know, how that spiritual care can look for a community that is fighting to make some kind of change somehow, somewhere. Liz, I wonder, you're the pastor here. How do you do spiritual care for people?
We really advocate self-care. And one thing that preachers never talk about is self-care, or mothers, or a lot of caregivers. We take care of the world, but we never think about ourselves. And so we advocate that, and we have sessions and times for people in our trauma work to come in and learn what self-care means and learn the importance of it. We also do storytelling for those who are the providers of care. And I think that, you know, wounded healers is what I call all of us, because we all got stuff and we all need to share it with someone, particularly those of us on the front lines. So we advocate that and teach you how important that is. We first teach you that it's important to grieve. And Otis Moss, who is one of my heroes in the world, a pastor out of Chicago, says that he calls it prophetic grieving. You grieve and then you do something. You grieve to say what's wrong with the world, and then you do something about it. So that's one part of it, that we advocate for givers of care, for caregivers, and then making sure that you know how to take care of self.
Jonathan, how has this come up on campuses? I'm really curious if folks are thinking about like that self-care or spiritual care, because campuses in their best life can be intense communities, and under crisis, then like that gets you know, grows so much.
I would say that campus or even in community, it's extremely important that there's a level of engagement with a base of people around spiritual values and principles that pays attention to and is sensitive to what's happening in society. Because when it was 10 years ago, I remember we had a campus ministry, which is really, even though my alma mater, St. Louis University, is a Catholic Jesuit institution, the pockets of space, there was plenty of interfaith spaces on that campus. And so what ended up happening was one thing that really had sparked, I think unintentionally.
We might have lost Jonathan. I'm going to shift over to
There's some
Aaron.
criticism from our campus ministry was that SLU at the time.
You're back, Jonathan. I think you're good now. We lost you for a minute.
Okay. So at the time when Michael Brown had been murdered and things like that, they held a vigil, like a candlelight vigil and things like that, which I've been familiar with in community. Like I said, coming from where I'm from, these homicides, vigils happening and all those different things as a way of responding to, having self-reflection, all those different things. But absent from that were calls from the institution at large in terms of what it would do to help support a neighboring community that was literally on fire. And so I think that part of it is that we see faith leaders, and there's plenty of examples. I think my Reverend Starsky Wilson, he's currently the head of Children's Defense Fund. Reverend Oseju Fuseku, who happened to write my forward, he's based in I think Seattle right now. Tracy Blackman, they were examples of faith leaders who married what was happening in Scripture and what was happening in terms of social engagement, community engagement, and things like that. How to marry those two things. So you weren't just looking at these and no matter what your religious affiliation is, there was a connection between what's happening in the church and what was happening in community. There were ways to get the congregations involved and marry that with their issues and things like that, and ways of solving those problems. And so I do want to emphasize what Reverend Liz said around self-care, because that's critically important. But showing a politically engaged body, not getting conversations about church and state and stuff like that, but just on a community grassroots level, actually, being, caring for the least of these and things like that. That was very important.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to pivot. Actually, this brings up another question. And Aaron, actually, I was going to throw this to you too. I think that that community care seems incredibly important. And you, I think earlier, was the one who said, you can't wait for the institution to catch up and take care of this for us. Your boss is not going to be able to take care of you for you. And I've said that about institutions too. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about, building that network of care? Institutions can be helpful. And then when they're not, we got to figure out how to work around them and how we take care of each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's so much for the most concrete reasons, right, of folks. We've seen this since COVID, like a spike in just grassroots groups doing mutual aid or whatever programming, whatever name you want to call it, to meet immediate needs around them, as a matter of necessity, right? And this is, of course, what has happened in poor and oppressed communities in this country from the jump, that have not been served by establishment institutions. But you have more and more people, lots more people every single day now, of course, losing access to that institutional support. And I think for me, this is both political and spiritual, is to understand that those efforts, to tie those efforts a little bit to what Jonathan was just saying about we're understanding the political realities right on the ground in our communities, and we're seeing those through a spiritual lens. And these projects are not charity. They're not like a nice tidy social service provision. They're essentially a protest that we live in a country that's not what the 19 richest households saw a $1 trillion increase in wealth last year. Meanwhile, people do not have the food they need for their kids. People are sleeping in the dead of winter in the back of their vehicles with infants. So these programs don't exist to say well, we can take care of it ourselves. They're part of our protest. And in these programs, we're nurturing people spiritually. We're nurturing people as developing leaders who are coming up with the solutions to their own problems. And we're pointing to these realities too, to say this is this is not just something we do to be nice, like this is something we do to survive, but it's also like how we're going to sustain this fight over the course of generations is by caring for each other. Because this cannot hold. This level of disparity, of injustice, of violence is not God's plan, and it can't hold. And so as we protest it, we care for each other and we carry each other through it.
Can I just add that one thing we can do is, and I think both of these gentlemen have talked about it, is getting out of our silos and partnering. And and that a lot of people are doing that in Boston area and in Sarasota, where I live. You have new allies and new friends and new partners to talk about, which is really powerful, I think. So I think we can continue to look for partners, because we tend to, I've been doing this for 100 years and this is how I do it, but it's all hands on deck now. We don't have the luxury of staying in our silos.
Yeah, and I'm finding that like we've said this before. I've found that some of these, the way the laws and the bills and the things that have come up in the recent months, I think the way they've been communicated to us has been like, it's about this one specific community, like River Glad's work, like it's the trans community. And most Americans don't think they know a trans person, which means they don't think this impacts their life whatsoever.
Right.
And part of what we do is to say, actually, here's the way in which you're going to be harmed by this thing that you think is impacting people you don't know. And we'll get to you probably know someone, you just don't know you know someone. That's a whole other thing, but there is going to be, this affects you. You're a part of it, whether you want to be or not. And like, that's your way of bringing in. I'd love to hear like question from you about like, where have you seen this? If you want to tell a story or an example of like where you've seen people who have inspired you, shown those acts of courage that you think is perhaps bringing this movement into a new direction now.
Anybody who speaks at one of our community trauma programs is courageous as far as I'm concerned. Maybe they're not holding up placards, maybe they're not marching in the street, but when you begin to tell your own truth, when you break through your own silence, that's courage. And these are the times that tend to silence us. So I am moved by people, ordinary people who decide, let me tell you, because you know what? A lot of trauma is connected to systems. It's not just interpersonal. It's because some system wasn't right. So let me tell you what happened to me. Truth telling is a courageous act in these days.
Mm-hmm. Other examples, courageous acts that you're seeing?
I would say definitely these young people on these campuses, them pushing the needle forward for all the retaliation, all the repression, all the threats that are being made to their livelihood, on their well-being. Traditionally we think about a college student, we think about a high school student. They're going to class, they may have some extracurriculars, and then they go about their day. They're trying to get their diploma, their degree. But these students are putting that on the line. They're putting their futures on the line for something greater than themselves. And I think that that's commendable. And I hope that, despite the national administration's anti-intellectual and autocratic actions and behaviors, that there's a level of solace they have and joy that they keep, despite the things that they're facing every day.
Yeah, I think ditto to both of those things. And I just, I organize with poor and low income people. And I just think that we underestimate, if we're not immediately living in poverty ourselves, which most of us actually are at this point. Most of us are, or are one paycheck away. But like, if you're unhoused, like you decide to continue to get up every single day, even when this society structurally, socially, like economically has literally thrown you away, like there's an enormous amount of courage it takes to do that. And also just like grit and determination and that spirit, just on a level of like a posture and a spiritual attitude, like that is that is what we all need to be leaning into right now, is that just dogged kind of determination to say, I still deserve to live, even when I have been denied that from every institution in this society. I know that I still deserve life, and I am not going to stop, and I'm actually going to come together with other people who are struggling like me, and we're going to find a way to live. So I feel really blessed to work with folks who are living that every single day.
Yeah, I've been loving. There's a lot of people who make a lot of grand pronouncements, and I've kind of had so much more appreciation for the people that are not saying a lot but doing a lot. And just like, again, in the face of this administration, just like not making a broad statement, be like, no, or I'm going to keep waking up and keep living and keep doing and just doing my everyday life, which feels so much like living our everyday life. Sometimes just feels like resistance by itself too, and getting to carry our values and ourselves and our person out there so much in public. I'm going to pivot us before one final question that I have for you all, but we had hoped that Rabbi Shoshana Meira Friedman was going to be able to join us today, but she couldn't because of a conflict. But she is a longtime climate change activist who also worked with children. And so we asked her, and she did. She recorded a message for us about inspiring children and collective moments. So we're going to play this video now, and then I want to get your all's reaction to it, and then I'll ask my last question, and we'll wrap up. So roll tape.
When I was a child growing up in the 80s and 90s, there was a strong message that you, the proverbial child, can save the world, or at least can change the world. And I took that very literally, and I thought that it was up to me to actually save or change the whole world. As a hyper empathic young kid, I was particularly sensitive to the environmental crisis and nature and animals and children suffering. And I felt so overwhelmed by this call to change or save the world that it drove my whole career trajectory from very young kid onward. But as I grew up, there was so much paralysis of, I want to do it, but no matter what, it's never going to be enough, because there was all of this pressure on the individual. And what we know actually is that that was intentional messaging by industry that started in the 1970s to make it the problem of the individual to solve the environmental crisis. What I learned as an adult after a training in community organizing, majoring in environmental studies at Oberlin College, and eventually becoming a rabbi and community leader, is that the power does not come from the individual, but from collective movements that power social change and change the window of what's possible, both politically and technologically. The message that I want to give to children and teens, but honestly to people of all ages in The Tide is Rising, So Are We, a Climate Movement Anthem, my new picture book, is that there is a global crisis. Nothing is sugar-coated in this book, but you are part of a whole immune system, a movement of people all across the world, millions, if not billions of people who care. And so many of those people are activated in a global climate movement that is powerful and is making real change and is changing what's possible, both politically and technologically. So that what is upon us as children, as teens, as individuals, is not to change or save the world, but to join a movement that can change or save the world as a collective. A big piece that's really important when we're doing climate work with kids, teens, or adults is to lead from a place of joy. So to me, this looks like doing the work with people we love and people we enjoy hanging out with. It looks like bringing in our creativity and our silliness and our fun. It looks like dancing or making art or going to a march wearing silly costumes. Whatever it is that lights you up, the climate movement needs that more than it needs any of your despair or self-flagellation. So bring your joy and bring your commitment to being part of this immune system, and give yourself and your kids and teens really meaningful at scale opportunities to contribute to the movement.
I just want to hear your reactions to anything that you heard that that she said.
Beautiful. It was very inspiring. And it certainly speaks to the idea that we're not alone. I mean, that's her point. And we have to remember that, because like I said, I think the conspiracy is to make us feel alone. And so the idea that we can, just get together with your best friend and or get together with your cousin. You can form movement kind of atmospheres that way. So I found it very hopeful what she said, and I love the idea about joy. We can have joy in the midst of chaos. It's possible.
Yeah, I love the joy part too. That was one, because I realized, we can be the people that always tell people how terrible it is all the time. Like we are people that are deeply aware of the brokenness of the world, and I think part for us, especially people that are watching that might think of themselves as leaders or even advocacy leaders, like giving people some future, some hope, some joy of like, this is not just despair, feels so important to me. So I'm really glad she said that.
I think the frame of like, this is what children need, but this is actually what we all need. We usually say that about kids, right? Like kids need this thing, but actually we all need it. Like kids need a lot of sleep. We all need a lot of sleep. Like kids need like the full emotional experience of, facing this world and choosing to live anyway. Like we all need that. And I think for me, it's a really strong counter to some of the ways we've just like taken organizing and like really professionalized it, instead of saying like, this is for everybody. You do not need a special degree for this. You do not need a certain level of education for this. You do not need to be a certain age for this. Like everybody has a right to be here, and to have a voice and power in the society. And so I think that piece is thinking about kids, especially as full participants in this work, is really helpful.
Yeah, I want to echo what you all have all shared. Again, ditto to the point about joy. Reverend Sekou, who I referenced earlier, talked about how, I don't want to be a part of a movement where we can't dance, where we can't celebrate, where we can't turn up, All of that's important, all of that's integral, all of that is helps sustain the work. As dreadful as things are, as painful as things can be, how can we dance in the rain? So I think that's important. And I love the point she made about, being an empath at an early age and having a connection to other people's feelings and what they're going through, and how that motivated her to do this work. Because it definitely resonates with me as well. But to the point that she made about how, it's not an individual task or endeavor, right? It takes community. It takes, reaching beyond our immediate areas and our immediate bubbles to form bridges and make this stuff happen. And so I really appreciated that.
That's wonderful. All right, I have one last question before we wrap up, and I've gone a little bit off script, or I'm rewording the question, I guess, because people have been watching, and we've been trying to look and talk about kind of the concrete actions that people can take. And one of the things that all the different settings that we've been in have used a lot of different like techniques, actions, things like that. But one of the things I've kind of realized, we're faith-based people, like there are a variety of gifts, and one spirit behind those gifts. And I will, for myself, say I think advocacy needs all of those gifts, right? I think a lot of people think advocacy is the person with the bullhorn and a sign in the street. I confess I am very conflict avoidant and not a fan of rallies. I will show up when I need to, but there's other things that I know that I'm good at, and realize like we need people who can do data entry and give money and write really well and call their editor, call their elected official and talk to their neighbors and like do all those like big things and quiet things. What are the gifts that you think people can be employing in this advocacy need that we have right now? Aaron, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. I mean, I've seen everything. We need people who cook, like who know how to feed people. We need people who know how to do childcare so that folks can come to meetings and not have to worry about, you know, who's going to feed them, who's going to watch their kids. We need people who are willing to drive carpools there. Like, we need all of just like the basics of living together. There's really nothing too small. And I, you know, when I think about faith communities in particular, like that's the stuff that we probably are already doing, right? Like, so can we imagine using that not just to like get to our place of worship, but also like to deepen our witness and our relevance, and our, you know, commitment to justice and thriving for all people in our communities, and communities everywhere. So I don't think there's a single task that's or skill set that's too small or irrelevant. Like, you need people who know how to fix the bathrooms. You need everything.
Love that. I love that. Other gifts you all see? Liz?
I would just add quickly that we need people, just to what we've been talking about, to help us get us back to joy. So we need dancers, we need singers, we need movement specialists. We need that, because we know the struggle. We know how to do that.
People who can make us laugh in the midst of all this.
Jokes, anything. And we need to do that for each other too. So yeah, I think that's really important to just remember that. Like Jonathan said, what was that quote? I don't want to be in any movement that doesn't dance. I mean, that's real. So I think we need to remember that, and don't grow cynical. Don't grow cynical.
And I would add, on top of what Aaron has shared and what Reverend Liz has shared, we also need, you know, institutional decision makers and those who are budding to become in that position to embody an ethic of servant leadership, right? And to not gatekeep. Sometimes gatekeeping can be a positive thing, but often when it's employed, you know, there's a gap that could be filled that's not filled because people with the wherewithal and the connections and the resources don't want to be neighborly. And so I think that that's something that needs to be addressed in this work as well, is decision makers having a rethinking and resetting of how they operate sometimes.
I love that. Those are that's what we need, watchers, viewers. And there's no task that is too small, and there's no task that's too big. And I think that it's the same spirit that informs all of them. If I can appropriate literature or scripture just a little bit for it too. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I know that we could keep doing it. And I hope that you all get to interact and work and talk to us whenever you get to see us in those times and spaces. Thank you so much, both for the contributions you've done for this last hour, and then obviously so much for the work that you are doing and continuing to do out in the bigger, wider world. Jonathan, Aaron, Reverend Liz, so deeply grateful for your ministry, for your advocacy, for the work that you're doing in the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless.
And thank you, audience, for joining us today. So if you registered, you're going to get an email soon that has a link to this conversation. And then we will also have links to resources, things like our books. There's organizations, things that we have worked with, connected with, that also can be really helpful for the work that you're doing. And then next week, you can tune in to these same channels to watch the final episode in this 3-part webinar series titled, again, We Are Our Neighbors, Protecting Immigrants and Refugees. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great day. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.